second area where you can optimize is applications and the caching layer. So I mentioned this caching word before. What is caching? A caching is basically just a buffer. You can think of it as a buffer that stores regularly accessed information, so that rather than having to go back to the infrastructure and find that information and generate it every time, it just serves it from the buffer. And there's all sorts of caching out there in the world of our tech. Your MacBook will do it if you've got a MacBook, or any laptop. Mail does it, right? The post office is basically like a cache, and websites do it as well, right? And they do it with things like content delivery networks that save content in different locations so that it can be quickly served to your users wherever they are. And there's different types of caching that you can use. The one that people typically use, and I'm going to put a bit of WordPress context around that because that's obviously what we can speak about most knowledgeably. But plugin-based caching is very easy to use, right? You just find a plugin that makes your server faster, and like Total Cache or something along those lines, and away you go. At the same time, server level caching is far more effective. So the reason why is that anything that requires you to install a plugin on your site, or requires traffic to come to your site before it can be actioned, is ultimately putting more pressure on that server, on that infrastructure. So if you can push that work away from the server, put it in front, then it's gonna be a far better experience. It's going to reduce the load on that server, and it's going to reduce the number of requests that are hitting it. So this is super complex and nerdy, and I'm not going to get into it, but it is complicated, right? There's multiple different layers at which you can and should apply caching in order to get a site performing well. And most CMS platforms or content management systems do not do this out the box, right? So make sure that you're working with someone who understands this if you don't understand it. And that isn't always going to be a developer, right? Developers aren't always going to be performance focused. They're going to be focused primarily on building code and functionality. So make sure you're working with experts that can help make sure you're set up in the most optimal way. As I mentioned, certain types of sites, particularly shopping and membership, bypass caching. So whereas with a brochureware site, on our platform, we would typically see 80% of the requests to a brochureware site served from our caching layers. So that traffic wouldn't even hit our servers because it's being served from cache before it gets there. With a shopping and membership site, you may only get 20% of that traffic being served from cache, which means 80% is actually hitting the server and the infrastructure. And hence, for the site with the same amount of traffic, you may need something 4 or 5 times more powerful to serve it, because you're getting 4 or 5 times the number of requests actually hit the infrastructure itself. Does that make sense? I know that it's a little bit complicated.
No, actually it does, right? Because the fact that most of the content there is so dynamic in nature, right? It just sort of makes sense to get it fresh from the server directly. Is that a right interpretation?
Yeah, if you have to get something generated by the server directly, that server is doing work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So anything that's dynamic basically forces the server to do work, and that slows it down. Anything that's not dynamic, that's static, that can be cached, can be served very quickly without adding any additional load to the server. So it's far more efficient. So this goes back to the point I was making at the start, whereas as the emerging consumers demanding more and more dynamic experiences and sites, that is putting more and more pressure on performance, because sites are driving more computational intensity.
Correct. So in fact, in general, right, every site, every nature of even your website for that matter, right? The website of WP Engine would look different to different people, right? Or so no matter whether you are a subscription business or a shopping site or a content publication, right? You would sort of at some point in time look at server level caching at some point in time. Yeah,
absolutely. And as I say, it's a complicated area. So, work with specialists that, are going to understand this stuff, because it's also changing all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like anything in technology, right? It's constantly moving goalposts, and sites are changing all the time as well. They're not static, right? People are
Yeah.
updating them. They're changing the functionality. So, this is why, managing performance as a permanent ongoing process is so important.
It's so important that, because a lot of times people assume that it's done once and done, and people approach it as a project, and
Yeah,
wherein, at the moment we hit 95 on Google page speed insights, that's when they say job done, right? And that's when the project
absolutely.
is, parked aside. But the fact that it's just rarely a day in day out job, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So you either need a team that can manage this, or you need to work with someone that's going to do it for you. Google actually, on that point, presented a stat again at our summit when they talked about performance budgeting, and they said that of sites that optimize for better performance, that do it as a project, as you said, within
Hmm.
6 months, 40% of them had regressed back to their original performance level. So
Ah,
within 6 months, almost half had regressed back. And that's because they weren't monitoring it, and they weren't, they didn't have a framework around making sure that they sustained that level of performance as the site continued to change and evolve.
yeah, right. So yeah, it is a full-time job also in that. Simple as that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I talked about caching. I mentioned CDN briefly. For almost every site, you should use a CDN. It will cache copies of your content at points of presence close to your users. It will reduce overhead on your servers. So, there's different types of CDN out there. Full page CDNs are better than the static CDNs. They will do a better job of caching, and in some cases they can even cache some dynamic requests if they are dynamic requests that are being generated in a consistent way or multiple times. But for almost every site, implementing a content delivery network is a good idea. And most of those web page test tools, the front end page test tools like web page test, that's one of the checks they will give. So they will give you a green or a red light as to whether you've got a CDN in place or not. Another thing which you can do, which makes sense, across the board, is when you're using secure sockets, secure certificates, which everyone should be now, because otherwise you're going to get penalized by Google, and your site isn't going to be secure. To have those SSL certificates terminated at the edge, not on your server. So providers like Cloudflare, again, is a partner that's integrated into our platform. They allow you to do that. So, essentially the handshake that a secure certificate does is done at the edge network, not done on your server. So again, all these little things that you can do, all add up, right? It's like, if you think of a sales funnel, right? And everyone always says, if you can make a 5% improvement at, 5 different layers of a sales funnel, you're going to get a 500% improvement in sales, right? All those little changes multiply out and really add up. Using a fast DNS host is super important as well. So your DNS is basically translating, your URL or your www.wpengine.com to an IP address. And believe it or not, some DNS hosts are faster than others and by up to 150 milliseconds. And that website here will tell you, how your DNS provider compares in terms of performance. So you can actually, have a look and make sure you're with a nice fast DNS. Cloudflare is, as I say, a partner of ours that we integrate with, and we definitely recommend them.